really this next part about swallowing and all that stuff should have been recorded into the other video, but I had already recorded it and I'm lazy. So without further ado, you're going to head, we're now in the mouth, we've chewed up the food, it's become a bolus. Bolus is just a really fancy way of saying chewed up food. It stays as a bolus as you swallow or deglute, or the process through the called deglutition, which is a fancy way of saying swallow. When you swallow or deglutinate, I don't think I said that right, deglutition, via the process of deglutition, as you swallow it, a complex array of signals are sent out via the cranial nerves. And if one of these cranial nerves are messed up, it makes deglutition quite hard. But we'll go ahead and continue onward with our discussion. When you swallow, both the nasopharynx, as you can see here, as well as the larynx, both seal off. The epiglottis seals off the trachea, while that vulva or the velum goes ahead and seals off. It's not vulva, uvula. Uvula seals off that nasopharynx. As it travels down the esophagus, it is still indeed called a bolus. It is both the longitudinal and the circular muscles, the two layers of the smooth muscle of all the digestive tract, move that bolus down into the stomach. As it is swallowing, it reaches that border of the stomach, it reaches the esophageal sphincter, which is important for keeping hydrochloric acids and all those contents that are being swirled around inside the stomach from reaching up into the esophagus. If it does reach up into the esophagus, it can cause ulcers or esophageal ulcers, and it's not a pleasant experience. Now that we've gotten through the esophagus, now that we've discussed it, by the way, the esophagus does not have any form of mechanical or chemical digestion. It's just simply there to transport the food down into the stomach. We have reached the stomach. Let's go ahead and describe the very basics of the stomach. We'll see that we have a lesser curvature on the superior portion of the stomach and a greater curvature. The lesser curvature is where, if not only is its curve is much less and more sharp and steep, but also the lesser omentum binds here. As well as this greater curvature, with that same thought process, you can pretty much bet your bottom dollar that that greater omentum binds here as well. The space inside the stomach is broken down into several pieces. The fundus, which is more of a gas storage area that deals with when you're shoving food down your pie hole and it starts filling up your stomach, that gas has to go somewhere, so often it goes up into the fundus, where you get the belching and burping. But the part that is like the topmost portion that you're going to see, or that's closest to the heart, is called the cardia. Cardia means, if you think about it, it sounds awful lot like cardiac, so it is the heart of your stomach. It is the portion closest to your heart. Some things to note: as you come in past the cardia, you go ahead and enter into the body of the stomach. You'll notice that the body of the stomach, as well as the other portions of that stomach, have nice thick folds of the mucosa. They are called rugae. Rugae are the folds of the stomach. Rugae are the folds of the stomach, and rugae are the folds of the stomach. The mucosa is the part responsible for all of the secretions that you'll see here: the hydrochloric acids, the enzymes, the liquids, and the mucus, and all that stuff. If your food, you're getting turned, you've made it, you're a bolus, you've made it here, you are now something called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. Chyme enters into the stomach, or the bolus enters into the stomach, becomes chyme, becomes liquefied even further, acidic. It transfers past the cardia, goes into the body, comes down into the pyloric antrum. All this area is mostly where the digestive process occurs. And then this is the pylorus or pyloric region of the stomach. So let's break it down a little quick. The pyloric antrum. Antrum is just a fancy way, or a fancy room inside a house where you first enter. You usually take off shoes, or they take your coat or something like that. So that is the antrum. Then you go into the pyloric canal, and then to the pylorus, or the pyloric sphincter. And the pyloric sphincter is the sphincter that separates the stomach from the small intestine, this duodenum. Some things to note about the histology of the stomach, where the tissues of the stomach, it does have a very similar setup to that of the rest of the digestive system. It has that mucosal layer, it has the smooth muscle layer, and it also has that tunic layer, that connective tissue layer. One notable difference between the two, though, is that it does indeed have a third layer of muscle. It has that longitudinal and circular muscle, which all the digestive tract has, but it also has something called an oblique layer. It makes sense that it has this extra layer to help because it has a different added amount of space where it needs to churn and mix that food in with one another, as well as with the stuff the stomach is secreting out. One important thing to note about this, even though it has that extra space, there's that rugae again, by the way, the mucosa. This is the inside of the stomach. One thing to note about this, very, very little is absorbed through the stomach. Extremely little is absorbed through the stomach. One, because it's producing a lot of mucus. That mucus is a hydrophilic layer that disallows a lot of things from going in, including the hydrochloric acid that it's producing. The only things that seem to escape into the blood at this point is water and alcohol, but only a little bit of it. Now, the function of the stomach, you'll see here, it's that mixing, it's that food reservoir I had mentioned earlier, as well as these secretions, which we'll go ahead and talk about now. Again, there's those three layers. There's the mucosa, submucosa, and the submucosa has more of those arteries, veins, and all that stuff. The muscularis, the three layers of muscle that you have, the oblique, the circular, and the longitudinal, followed by that serosa. Now that mucosal layer, this is the stuff that secretes stuff. We got 5 different types of cells. You've got 2 of these cells have a very similar setup to one another and do the almost exact same thing. A surface mucosa, which secretes mucus, as well as a mucosa neck cell, which also secretes mucus. These 3, though, have very specialized secretions going on. The parietal cell produces hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Chief cells produce pepsinogen and gastric lipase, and G cells produce the hormone gastrin. Let's go ahead and break these apart, starting off with the parietal cell. The parietal cells, I already mentioned, makes hydrochloric acid. It makes it in a similar fashion to what with the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. What it is doing is it's converting H2O and CO2 into H2CO3. And if you remember back into our discussion on the pulmonary system, the respiratory system, I did it again, the respiratory system, that H2CO3 is very acidic. It's more acidic than most of our body cells. It is more acidic than most on our body cells. If you have H2CO3 floating around willy-nilly and in great abundance, then you've got some uh-ohs. What it does with that extra hydrogen, instead of letting it release back into the blood, it takes that hydrogen and it's going to move it towards the stomach lumen. That the remainder, the HCO3, is pushed out into the blood because, well, it's an alkaline tide, it takes care of it. And with that same pressure, with that concentration gradient, you get an antiport setup where chloride comes in exchange for that HCO3. Now that chloride is transported to the lumina and both are released out into the wild blue yonder of your stomach lumen. This hydrogen, though, is a hydrogen pump, meaning it has to be forced out. And it requires energy to do so. What you see often is something called a peptic ulcer. In this case, is the overstimulation of hydrochloric acid, or you got H. pylori, which is a type of bacteria that was discovered recently back in the early 2000s. What happens is that hydrochloric acid is able to get to that stomach lining and start chewing away at it. You can see that this is in your tissue. Here, we got pictures of the stomach as well as the not quite esophageal, forgive me, but the duodenal issues. This is from Coy et al. 2017, by the way. Now, something interesting about this is that just a really quick brief history on the H. pylori. Again, it wasn't discovered until 2003. How they determined that this was indeed a bacteria that was causing it. Most people had just assumed that it was stress-induced ulcers, that stress is causing the problems. You hear it all the time. If you have stomach issue, if you're having stomach problems, you're letting stress get to you too much. Don't let it happen too much. But a couple of pair of doctors, I believe they're from Sweden, were pretty darn certain it was a bacteria. And they had gathered data, they had proven it, and then they went a step further. One of these doctors never had peptic ulcers, and then he took an added crazy measure, which he took some of the incubated bacteria that he had, and he ingested it, and started developing these peptic ulcers. Now, let's say that you are experiencing these things. It's not because of H. pylori or anything. What you can do, you can give this patient a proton pump inhibitor. What that proton pump inhibitor is doing is it's coming along and hitting that proton pump that's shoving hydrogens out into that stomach lumen. By doing so, you decrease the amount of hydrochloric acid being developed. The mechanisms here also slow down too because of the mechanisms of saying, hey, we're too acidic in this cell, we can't keep on doing this, it slows it down. Something else to remember about those parietal cells, again, is that parietal cells, not the chief cells like I have here, parietal cells, I'm going to go ahead and fix that right now. Parietal cells, parietal cells also produce something called intrinsic factor. And what that is, it's a type of protein. It's a signaling protein that's released out into the gastric lumen that eventually will make it down to the lower intestine and induce the absorption of vitamin B12, which is created by your bacteria. Vitamin B12, you got your friendly gut bacteria. Vitamin B12 is extremely important for inducing several things. One is the formation of DNA. If you have vitamin B12 deficiency, then that DNA, the cell's ability to duplicate and divide decreases, which in most cases not a huge issue unless you really like having red blood cells. Erythropoiesis is also heavily deterred by the lack of vitamin B12 because it is always, these cells need to duplicate, they need to grow in order to even make it to the red blood cells state. So by removing vitamin B12, you're effectively, these red blood cells that you're creating become defective, and well, you get hemolysis and you get an anemia. Anemia is a lack of red blood cells, which makes it difficult for you to transport your varying gases, the oxygen primarily, as well as the conversion of CO2 and H2O into carbonic acid and the transportation back up to the lungs. The chief cells. There are two things that the chief cells do. This is, they produce something called pepsinogen. Remember how I said there was a rule about most enzymes end with an ACE and they tell you what to do? Well, this one is one of those that, well, that doesn't follow that rule. Pepsinogen is an enzyme that breaks down polypeptides. Polypeptides is a really fancy way of saying big proteins. And it likes to break it. Pepsinogen in its active form called pepsin will break down protein in the stomach. And it's inactive, it will be inactive if it's alkaline or neutral pH, meaning that if it's basic or neutral pH, it will not activate. Pepsinogen is only converted to pepsin when it's in the presence of hydrogen ions or high concentrations of hydrogen ions, aka hydrochloric acid is a wonderfully high amount of hydrogen, or the high levels of hydrochloric acid in your stomach is very decent for it to be able to become activated. So pepsin, when it is activated, will then take protein and break it down. Just an FYI, a lot of proteins have to work in a very similar fashion, where it starts off in an active form and then something comes along to activate it. Insulin. There's actually something called pre-proinsulin. because it has to be cleaved like twice in order for it to become active. G cells. I am missing something about the chief cells. One last thing about chief cells is that it does create gastric lipase. Now, even though it's called gastric lipase, it is not active in the stomach, but it does become active when it comes into the duodenum and gets introduced to a neutral pH. G cells, the last cells that we're going to care about here, is that gastrin. Gastrin is created by G cells, and gastrin is stimulated by the stretching of the stomach. So if you're sticking food into your stomach, gastrin will be released by these G cells because these G cells have been stretched. What gastrin does is it makes the stomach work harder and better. It induces the parietal cells to make more hydrochloric acid. It induces the stomach muscle, the smooth muscles of the stomach to start working and churning a little bit more, as well as it induces the opening of the pyloric sphincter. That way, that kind that's there now, that's also already in liquid form, will go ahead and easily pour into that region, into the duodenum for further processing and absorption. With that, here is your chart. If you're watching this, go ahead and take a pause here, read through this, make sure you understand it. These are all different types, important points behind the stomach. And that is it for this. This is the content you see. This is what the national chamberlain has called the content for week 1. I'm going to go ahead and say. With that, hope you all have a good time, and remember, you got this.